Part 1. Intentions by Oscar Wilde. Paradox is never so absolutely king as when you try to determine the separate ways of life and of literature. The poet lives his life, you say, and that is one matter. The poem lives its life, and that is quite another matter. Between the writer and his writings, the discriminating must observe divorce. Then, directly contradicting, is the theory of the goodly who are touched with the taint of Puritanism. Every written line, these hold, is the intimate expression of self. The sinner cannot write other than sinful things. The farther you fare, if you would reach dogma on this point, the deeper will you mire. Paradox alone rules, and rules nowhere so supremely as in the case of Oscar Wilde. If, on the one hand, we plead that it is the man's letters, not his life, that posterity should cherish, on the other, it is folly for us to forget how completely in Wilde the artist chose life as well as letters for expressing self. Life itself is an art, and has its modes of style no less than the arts that seek to express it, wrote Wilde in his marvelous essay on Wainwright. Marvelous in itself, and more so for the tragic thaumaturgy by which time made of it a prophecy of Wilde's own fate. And Charles Whibley later echoed with, "There is an art of life, as there are arts of color, form, and speech." Yet, if we incline to consider Wilde as the artist in life, if we recall his career as aesthete, as triumphant dandy, as successful playwright, we have also to remember the tragedy, the prison, the dismal, horrid, crumbling to a sordid death. Inextricably mingled are his living and his writing, yet to consider his prose, his plays, his poetry, only by the light of his prison and its aftermath were as stupid as to imagine that one may ever quite read any page of his without finding there some echo of a personality. No man whose energy, whose delight in a personal pose, and whose paradoxic infatuation with art could make such an impress on the time and the land he lived in can be erased by any act of his own, or by our volition from the world's chronicle. If his triumphs were gorgeous, if he turned the fogs of London into rose gardens for his fancy, if in vanity and impertinence he had ruled his world as a monarch, dictating in taste and thought and language, he was to taste later the depths of despair and pain. His soul, once so arrogant in its scorn of human emotion, was to suffer sorrow and shame and contempt. The mood of the triumphant dandy we have in his earlier, that of the self-pitying sufferer in his later writings. In life, as in letters, he was always the man of his mood, the artist in attitudes. One must take him, if one can, at the particular mood that best pleases one. While it is my mind now to concern myself only with that mood of Wilde's in which he produced the essays in Intentions, it was scarce possible to come to this without touching, however lightly, upon the perplexing paradoxic problem of the man's life and its bearing on his art. Just as all his living was a paradox, so the relation between that living and his writing must ever remain one. A month after Wilde's death, when Puritan ears were to all intents closed against his name, I published an argument seeking to disestablish the connection between his noble artistic achievement and the cloud under which his name still lay. That was, of course, special pleading. Now, barely 5 years later, time has nobly fulfilled all I then forecast. It takes no courage now, as then upon the news of his death, to admit one's appreciation of Oscar Wilde's artistic accomplishment. In continental Europe, no play is more frequently performed at this writing than Wilde's Salome. His books and his plays are everywhere conspicuous. Colder critical perspective of time and comparison has not diminished the regard for his writings. The posthumous publication of certain prison letters of his called de profundis tended, but the other day to darken counsel somewhat. Here, again, was the gaping wound laid open, the tortured soul writhing to find itself amid its countless attitudes. Here what had been arrogance was turned to pity, and to a pagan yet piteous interpretation of the Christ, yet here still was the pose, the attitude, the unquenchable artist in attitudes. Nothing in the case before us can be thrown away. It is as futile to consider the life alone as the letters alone. All was of a piece. Yet the happy mean, the discriminating way is, having in mind the art his life assumed, to consider as distinctly as possible the art he put on paper. His life was as complete a work of art, with heights and depths, triumphs and tragedies, as was ever composed. There, then, is one magnum opus. Some will like it, some loathe it. Some, in reading his written art, will like to forget his acted art. Some will recall it gladly. You see, do what one will, one proceeds in circles, issuing always upon paradox. Paradox and moods, it is always these in the case of Wilde, and never more so than in the case of his essays, his fairy tales, his poetry, notably the Ballad of Reading Gaol, his exquisite plays, living still not only in themselves but as models to later playwrights, have my full meed of appreciation, yet it is in his essays that I find him at his best. Here the wisdom under his paradox is most discoverable. Here, forgetting his life, one may most clearly discern his most characteristic attitude toward life. Here, in Intentions, are the most precious utterances of this amateur in art and life. Jewels of wit and paradox are in these pages scattered so profusely that if once one start to pick them up, one may not stop, save for sheer weariness. Truly one may declare, as William Watson does of Lowell, that the brilliance is so great and so ubiquitous that it pays the not inconsiderable penalty of diverting our attention from the real soundness that underlies it all. So dazzling is the flash, and at times so sharp the report, that we scarcely notice the straightness of the aim. In that portion of the bookish world about us that fashions its verdicts upon academic formula, the existence of any essayist save Lamb, Montaigne, and Stevenson is slurred. Yet of essayists who have done memorable things critically in our own time, there are at least three: Oscar Wilde, Bernard Shaw, and George Moore. All have said trenchant things memorably, often impertinent, yet never negligible. Intentions is magnificent with impertinences, but also with truths. As a book, it has splendidly the sincerity of Wilde's insincerity. It constantly makes ridiculous the petty formulas of petty dogmatists. Observe Richard Burton, not of New Arabian Nights, but of New England, declaring that in the essay an author stands self-revealed. He may mask behind some other forms, in some measure, but commonplaceness, vulgarity, thinness of nature are in this kind instantly uncovered. The essay is for this reason a severe test. In the very first essay in Intentions, the one entitled The Decay of Lying, Wilde sets all awry that assertion about the mask and what it hides. He declares that what is interesting about people is the mask that each one of them wears, not the reality that lies behind the mask. How, before the nimbleness of this creature of masks and moods, can we, for any length of time, observe the stolid solemnity of the dogmatists and the dealers in the sententious? We are in a land of masks and moods. Literature is the advertisement of one's attitude toward life. It is the record of a mood. It is the impress, writ in wax, of some mask we wore at some moment. It is a quantity of conflicting things. It is revelation and it is masquerade. Whatever it is, literature is something of which the essays and Intentions must ever be accounted typical. Irritating, insincere, paradoxical, but indubitably literature. Epigram jostles contradiction, truth elbows the fantastic, paradox plays through every interval. Yet these essays remain arrestingly entertaining, eminently readable. Upon the style of Intentions there is little need to dwell. Brilliant, inconsequent, mannered, it is ever the essence of the man himself. This style was the man. You can, if you will, read him in every line of it. Here are all the triumphant moods of his triumphant, arrogant years, expressed in glittering epigram and luminous diction. Just as in the style of the Ballad of Reading Gaol, you may mark the prison bars, and in that of De Profundis, you may hear the cry of a soul desperately attempting to achieve sincerity through a chastened body. Every one of the essays in Intentions marks a happy pose. The reader here has Oscar Wilde in his gayest moods. There are in this book 4 essays, the chief of them, The Critic as Artist, being in 2 parts. Every page of them is readable. You may suffer irritation, your dearest Billies may suffer, but you will read on. This is mannered matter from a mannered man, but man and matter hold you to the end. The author's panoply of paradox guards him against the commonplace. Never is the reader safe in assuming that the brilliant manner has nothing behind it. Let me instance the much discussed theory about art imitating life, so adroitly set forth in the first of these essays, entitled The Decay of Lying. Wilde's whim, you will find, insisted upon the imitations that life gave of artistic inventions. He told of English feminine beauty actually taking on the lines and hues first created by certain painters. He told of a woman who acted exactly upon the Becky Sharp model. He gave instance upon instance. Our newspapers and our observation continually confirm the theory, at first so seemingly far-fetched. Sir Walter Besant, in his volume called The Doubts of Dives, gave a trenchant instance in this sort of imitation. The American journalist Julian Ralph once recounted the incident of a model in a New York art school who absolutely yet unconsciously rehearsed the action of Du Maurier's heroine in suddenly refusing to pose for the altogether. Finally, do you recall the incident of Wilde's appearing before the curtain of a theatre where a play of his was being produced for the first time, and astonishing the audience with cigarette in his fingers, a green carnation in his lapel? Mr. Robert Hitchens afterwards used the green carnation as the name of a satiric novelette aimed at Wilde, and in the spring of this year, in which I write, 1905, nearly a score of years later, in other words, a florist of Los Angeles, in California, succeeded in producing from the soil a green carnation. Who, after that, can quite laugh out of countenance such a sentence as this, from The Decay of Lying? A great artist invents a type, and life tries to copy it to reproduce it in popular form like an enterprising publisher. The temptation to quote is hardly countered as one reads and rereads these essays. Even before we approach Wilde's lucid and yet elusive interpretation of the function of criticism, as expressed in The Critic as Artist, we find in the earlier essay, The Decay of Lying, much that bears upon this matter. Indeed, the effort throughout Intentions is to build up the highest estimate the world should give to criticism. Always, under paradox and contradiction, is the plea for the critic, whose art is also creative. In The Decay of Lying, Wilde declares that the only portraits in which one believes are portraits where there is very little of the sitter and a great deal of the artist, and one has only to think of Whistler and Sargent to realize the germ of truth that lies here. It is in The Critic as Artist that we have Wilde at his best as brilliant essayist, keen, critical analyst. Excepting certain impudent but amusing passages in The Confessions of a Young Man, no phrases upon contemporaries are so memorable as some that Wilde here sets down. Mr. Henry James, we are here told, writes fiction as if it were a painful duty. Mr. Hall Caine writes at the top of his voice. Of Meredith, he declared that his style is chaos illuminated by lightning. As an artist, he is everything except articulate. Browning he termed the most supreme writer of fiction it may be that we have ever had. The only man that can touch the hem of his garment is George Meredith. Meredith is a prose Browning, and so is Browning. He held that from the point of view of literature, Mr. Kipling is a genius who drops his aspirates. For realism, he had no phrase harsh enough. He deplored novels with a purpose, despised Zola, admired Balzac, and summed up his theory of literature by declaring that it meant distinction, charm, beauty, and imaginative power. I do not hesitate in saying that the function of criticism in its relation to art and life has never been better expressed than in this essay on the critic as artist. Life itself is art, he had written elsewhere. Yet now, in this essay still under consideration, he says that anybody can make history. Only a great man can write it. But he gives you for that and countless contradictions like it plenty of epigrammatic excuse. Note this and think of his later adventures in tragedy and in pity. The man who regards his past is a man who deserves to have no future to look forward to. When one has found expression for a mood, one has done with it. Finally, there is the culminating fascination of the essay entitled Pen, Pencil and Poison. This chapter on Thomas Griffith's Wainwright is one of the subtlest, uncanniest bits of appreciative writing in the history of letters. In every line of it, one may read, recalling Wilde's subsequent career, the phrases of prophecy and unconscious self-revelation. It is as if he had, years before the event, given us a document that might serve as an apology or explanation. There is no argument that a pleader for Wilde could use that Wilde had not himself used here for Wainwright, who was an artist, poet, dilettante, forger, and poisoner. Now, when one has the later documents, the ballad and the letters from prison, such passages as these, from pen, pencil, and poison, ring doubly poignant. The sentence now passed on him was, to a man of his culture, a form of death. The permanence of personality is a very subtle metaphysical problem, and certainly the English law solves the question in an extremely rough and ready manner. His crimes seem to have had an important effect upon his art. They gave a strong personality to his style. One can fancy an intense personality being created out of sin. The fact of a man being a poisoner is nothing against his prose. The domestic virtues are not the true basis of art. There is no essential incongruity between crime and culture. There, in those words of Wilde's, written years before they could come to have application in his own case, is the expression of the vital truth that posterity can never blink, no matter how biased. Had we before us nothing save the essay on Wainwright, there would be evidence enough for calling Wilde a brilliant creative critic. This is biography, this is art. What Robert Louis Stevenson did for Villon, briefly, brilliantly Oscar Wilde has here done for Wainwright. Space forbids that I dwell upon the main interpretation Wilde gives in Intentions of the Theory of Critical Art. I must point you to those fascinating pages themselves, conscious that each line of mine has but delayed your coming to the feast itself. It is possible that this new edition of Intentions, for which I make this introduction, may reach some who have never yet read Wilde in the essay form. To them, my envy goes. They will close the book, I think, upon the Wainwright essay. Unlike Wainwright, Wilde issued from prison gay with fine intentions, brilliant still his talks, brilliant still his plans for new plays, great ones, all remained undone, unwritten, for him who had said, one must never return to the past. There remained nothing but revocations from the past. Gradually, all deserted him, friends, his own wit, even the curiosity seekers. He could no longer talk, no longer write. The passing of the Paris Exposition found him, and with it death, with all his sins upon him, huddled, so to speak, with the memories of a splendid career, a ghastly disaster. No death in all history seems more horrid than this one. Beau Brummel in Calais, Verlaine in Paris do not surpass this tragedy. The sunflowers, the lilies, the carnations, and the velvet are gone. Yet the satire and the caricature they aroused remain part of our artistic treasure. The tinsel of aestheticism is dust, yet we are even now heirs to its gain in knowledge of the Japanese arts. The drawings of Du Maurier and Beardsley, the writings of Hitchens, the words of Gilbert, all testify obliquely to the power of the man whose hell, more literally than that of any other man, was indeed paved with intentions.